Juliet and one of our other teammates gets attacked by a hippo. The boat literally comes up out of the water and flops over, but they fall out. So I just see this canoe come up out of the water and flip over, and there's no heads.
Sue is a world-class whitewater athlete.
She's actually a legend. You leave the military, you actually do use the GI Bill to go to college. You also then return to your serious paddling career and ultimately become U.S. national champion. Tell us a little bit about what it is like to become an unexpected parent at 56 years old.
When I was 52 years old, I got a call, and he called up with this 20-something-year-old woman to tell me that they were going to be parents. Really went into the crapper when the birth mom decided she was going to leave her relationship.
What did you learn about, raising a child, especially a child that spent the first part of their life in a neglected situation?
Yeah. Well,
This episode of the Ready State Podcast is brought to you by Laird Superfood.
We're rolling into summer. We have some river trips planned. What happens every afternoon on the river trip?
So we pull into whatever camp we are.
Wherever.
And
whenever.
Invariably, it is 1,000 degrees. Like we're somewhere in the West in usually a desert environment. We're pulling up onto a white sand beach. It's 3:00 in the afternoon. It's nuclear hot. And Kelly decides he's going to make coffee.
Always.
That
it's like 3:00. I fire up and have this cup of coffee, and it changes my life. And for almost a decade now, Laird coffee has been my
we
choice.
pull up on the beach of a river trip, 3:00 in the afternoon, and you fire up a cup of coffee. I will say you don't normally drink coffee after about noon, but you make an exception on these river trips and seem to be able to sleep okay.
Laird has always had good taste in coffee, and you should try the base coffee. But they've got a mushroom coffee, shade grown, organic, combined with some functional mushrooms. I'll tell you what.
Yeah, like chaga, lion's mane, cordyceps.
I've known Laird a long time. Have we had a chaga pot on our...
Always.
We've had chaga pot. It's a lot easier to just add the lion's mane in, add the cordyceps, get the chaga. With the coffee, it is fantastic. It doesn't change the flavor of the coffee.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And also, if you just feel like you can't manage a 3 p.m. coffee, but you sort of want to have this lovely experience, which is part of the joy of drinking coffee, drink some chaga, drink some mushroom coffee.
You definitely could do that. Look, I think we can look at our coffee ritual as a way of getting more micronutrients, better whole foods, higher quality fats. Quit putting coffee made in your coffee.
True fact. And all of their products are built around clean, functional, real food ingredients.
Whole foods.
They're made of whole foods. This stuff is awesome, and it tastes so good.
Whole bunch of things. You're into greens in the morning, do it. Check out Laird Superfood. You're into just trying a little,
You just want really good
bump.
Coffee.
We're also getting into summertime where you can blend up a little.
We call it a Laird Slurpee.
Yeah, it's a coffee shop plus a little creamer and a little blender. Whew, it's so good.
It's the best.
Laird Slurpee. If you want to learn more, go to lairdsuperfood.com/TRS and use code TRS20 for 20% off and free shipping. Heads up, Ready State listeners. Today's episode is brought to you by The World as You'll Know It and their new season, The Future of Aging.
Longevity has exploded into a multi-billion-dollar industry that attracts both hucksters and Nobel laureates. This season sorts the science from the sales pitch.
You'll hear how mortality from heart disease and cancer has already dropped double digits and what breakthrough therapies are next.
They tackle big questions. Can an older brain be rewired to think like it's 25? Do any of those headline-grabbing biohacks hold up under real scrutiny? Are we reaching a natural lifespan ceiling, or is there room to push it?
If you love evidence-based talk about living longer and better, hit The World as You'll Know It in your player of choice.
Listen, learn, and keep those BS detectors sharp. Now, on with our episode. Sue Norman, welcome to the Ready State Podcast.
So great to see you both.
So I feel that you should set this up, Kelly.
Okay. So a couple things. One is that Sue is a world-class whitewater athlete.
She's actually a legend.
Champion
legend of whitewater
slalom
paddling.
paddler. She even taught kayaking where I grew up as a child.
Yeah, I mean, the connections there are still blow my mind.
I mean, she's obviously like the Cheerio magnetism, where the two Cheerios are floating, the last two Cheerios in the bowl of milk. We're going to stick together eventually. That's basically our relationship. I became Sue Norman aware, though, when we started racing all of this crazy whitewater. And I think I really started hanging out with you a little bit at Gore Canyon. That was when I sort of was chatting you up, and I was like, man, these women are real fast down this class 5. But my most singular awareness of Sue Norman, and you'll see that Juliet and I refer to as Sue Norman as one word, not even though she's Sue Norman. She's always been, is that we're in Chile at the World Championships, and you and she have just taken, I want to call it an odyssey of thousands of little puddle jumpers. You've taken like ferries. It's
Oh
just,
my God.
it has been an epic. They're weighing you. You're not sure you're going to get over the mountains. You guys get there. You've been traveling for 4 days.
Literally.
You walk down and you're stirring your Nescafe. We're about to go run the river, this class 5 river, just to scout it a little bit. And you didn't say a word. And I was like, well, that Juliet girl's kind of stuck up. But Sue, you just chatted us right up. And I was like, well, at least I have Sue Norman to hang out with.
Well, I was very sleep deprived.
And that is the story of how I got dragged along on this incredible relationship between you and Juliet.
And so I think it would be great, Sue Norman, if you could tell the audience here today how you and I met before we go back in time to talk a little bit about your story. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, that sounds great. Well, yeah, I remember that very vividly. So I was on a U.S. women's whitewater rafting team that had been around for a while, but for our next event, we needed 2 more paddlers to join the core 4 that we had that I'd been with from the beginning. And what we found out when we started um, interviewing, which is pretty different in rafting than other jobs, and we started calling up and asking people and paddling with various women in the rafting world. And what we found right away that there were women that knew how to guide rivers and had good class 5 whitewater skills guiding rivers. We found women who were in pretty good shape or very good shape from other sports, but didn't know how to paddle. And it was extremely difficult to find 2 other people to join our team that both had the athletic temperament and background to be strong and also be able to handle the multitude of challenges that comes with racing class 5 whitewater.
With your heart rate at 190 for over a half hour.
Right.
And that's when our beautiful relationship began, Sue Norman.
Yes. And day 1, when we all paddled with you, it was unanimous. It was just like, oh boy, we found one. And then soon after we found
And let me
her.
just jump in and say, when you say core 4, you are 4 extraordinary women, legends, Hall of Fame, world champions, Amelia Earharts of whitewater paddling, where you're the first women to run first ascents. You're the first woman to be invited on these international rafting thing. So this core 4, we were, let's say we're a little more ragtag than you. Maybe we didn't have the bona fides that you all did. But I remember we were some bros who had some talent, and we coming up against this juggernaut, like our reflection in the women's side. It was sort of haves and have-nots. You all were like, you were fancy pants.
We did have the haves.
And then there was us.
Yeah. So, I mean, if it's not already obvious to our listeners, Sue Norman was my longtime U.S. National Whitewater Team teammate. We paddled together for 5 years and longer.
And then you even went back and won another national.
And then, we went back as masters athletes. But not to have our timeline be too insane, Sue, but before we start talking about your background, could you just give a quick recap of who else was in the core 4 with us, like a highlight of who was in this boat? Because I will tell you that when I showed up, which I remember those tryouts very clearly and I had no idea that I was a shoe-in. And I revered all of you and understood very clearly who you were, what impact you'd all had on the whitewater world. And I was just like, I'm just excited to be here at this tryout.
This is nearly 30 years ago.
Yeah. So who were all of you guys?
Well, first I have to say Kelly Califatich, who was a renowned international whitewater guide, stunt double for Meryl Streep in The River Wild, just was all over the place for a long time and was one of the first friends I made when I moved out to California to work as a kayak instructor, along with our close friend Julie Munger, who also worked all over the United States, mostly raft guiding, doing first descents on various rivers in California, and now has a very successful whitewater rescue business, teaching wilderness first aid and swiftwater rescue. And then
And she's a Hall of Famer. She's a whitewater Hall of Famer.
yeah, a Hall of Famer. Yeah, she just because she's done so much in both her paddling as well as developing safety curriculum for the sport and teaching it. And then lastly was Beth Rippins, who I actually met through kayaking, and she did a lot of very extreme kayaking, probably the first woman to do a number of things in that arena, but also was a very competent international whitewater guide. And those three women were kind of it during the day. They were the ones that were out there with um, other men building international rafting throughout the world.
Yeah, they were legends. So there's a lot I want to talk about today in terms of our whitewater antics in those days. And, just for context, we're talking about like the 90s and early aughts is when we were doing our paddling together. But I'd like to go way back in time. And I mentioned this in the pre-roll. And I'm going to try to formulate a question out of this. But in reading your new book, Risk, which is a memoir about your life that we're going to talk about extensively today, one of the things that surprised me in being your friend for over 25, I think almost 30 years at this point, is that I did know you had a difficult childhood. I knew that your mom had MS. I knew that your parents had separated so that your grandparents could take care of your mom. I knew you'd grown up in the Midwest. But it wasn't until I read your book, your memoir, that I realized how difficult it was. Because in addition to what was going on with your mom, you and your twin brother seemed very vulnerable, that you were sort of financially on the precipice living with your dad, that you moved a ton, and that generally speaking, it wasn't a childhood marked by stability or security in any notable way. So I'm not even sure where my question is here, but before we get into all things whitewater paddling and your memoir and becoming a mom at age 50, tell us a little, set the stage a little bit about like where Sue Norman came from.
And how you ended up in a whitewater kayak.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, my dad started whitewater canoeing. He actually took my mom on their first canoe trip when she was 6 months pregnant up in the Great Lakes. And then they lived in Kansas City, and they decided there was a new paddling club called the Ozark Wilderness Waterways Society that he joined and started doing canoe trips in the Ozarks. And this is 1960. They were at the forefront. And my mom wrote him a letter one weekend while he was gone and basically said, "That's it. No more playing the great white explorer. Either we all go or nobody goes." So that's how I started canoeing with my twin brother and my mom and my dad at age 2.5 with this amazing canoe club in the Ozarks. And they were very involved in the Wild and Scenic Act for rivers because they were part of that club during that momentous time. And we would have grown up as a normal, happy paddling family for my whole childhood, I'm sure, except my mom got this devastating illness. And she started getting symptoms when I was 5. A lot of people live with MS for many years and can stay pretty ambulatory, but she had a very acute form of it, which put her in a wheelchair by the time she was 8, and by the time I was 10, she was pretty much bedridden. And so she had to go live with my grandparents because my dad didn't have the resources or the capacity to put her in a home or have skilled nursing. There was a better arrangement she could have. And he really struggled, it threw him off kilter. And that's the thing about, when we talk about needing health care for all, that's exactly why. Because normal, average, well-functioning families can be flattened in an instant when something like this happens. And so my dad struggled financially for my entire childhood because he was a comedy writer and cartoonist. And as you can imagine, his mental capacity for doing his work was impaired. So, as you said before, kids that grow up without stability, I had no sense of security or stability. My dad was great. I loved him, but I was always hyper aware of how tenuous his situation was and that we were all just hanging on by a thread. But fortunately, he found that continuing on with whitewater paddling was one of the anchors that he used for both himself and for us to deal with our life, that in our kind of crappy urban homes and crappy urban neighborhoods, we would escape and go first canoeing. And then when we moved out to California, there was a growing population of whitewater paddlers that was happening there. And he got sucked in and then pulled me and my brother into that experience when we were about 13.
And maybe you've never asked this question or wondered, but if your mom had been diagnosed with MS today, would her experience and outcome be different, or is it just that she was unlucky enough to get a really aggressive form, and the trajectory would be different, or has the universe changed in terms of MS treatment now?
Not that I'm aware of. There's some holistic stuff that they know kind of helps with, as with a lot of other neurological conditions, but there's no cure.
Yeah. So this whitewater thing was a true escape for you all. I mean,
Yes.
Not only to escape the reality of your mom's illness, but your very difficult living situations, moving a lot. But, the whitewater paddling was the through line of your childhood. And even to the point where you described, and maybe you can talk a little bit about this, about how you maybe didn't fit in as well in school in many ways, and that you were able, however, to find real community in the whitewater world. So tell us a little bit, like, what was that like?
And I just want to point out that several of your teammates, I know Beth Rippins would credit learning to kayak in high school as saving her life.
Yeah.
Julie grew up the daughter of a experienced Grand Canyon guide and adventurer, and that was her through. I started kayaking when I was 12, and I'm so grateful that I found this way to scare the crap out of myself with my best friends and like almost self-soothe with that adrenaline and serotonin.
Yeah. Well, the community started out with a community of adults. My dad was really good about, wasn't a solo guy. We joined clubs wherever we went. So we were with the Ventura Canoe Club in California when we started kayaking, and then there was a guy named Tom Johnson who was the first Olympic coach in Whitewater that had a lot going on up in Kernville. So we would drive there up on the weekends and be around this group of people. And my brother and I got a lot of attention because there weren't a lot of kids. So we were definitely given a lot of attention and encouragement, and we always felt safe with that group. And I felt special. But it was more than that. It was the camping on the river where I didn't have to be aware of the environment that I lived in regularly. in a campground, everybody's equal, you know, and you're in this beautiful environment. The river itself is just this powerful entity. It's the beauty of it, it's the dynamicness of it, it's giving you challenge, you know, that you have to face, but it also feels nurturing at the same time. It's really a very complex, mix of things that doing a river sport provides for you. And then when we moved to, Ohio, because as you said, we moved a lot, right away, my dad found the Keel Hollows Canoe Club, and that's when I really started forming my first kind of fast friendships with other daughters of the Whitewater Revolution who were getting dragged into this, along in this sport of whitewater kayaking with their dads. Not with our moms, and they had healthy, you know, moms at home, but they had no interest. But our dads were taking us out, and I had 2 other girls my age that were part of the Keel Haulers Canoe Club that became very good friends, and I've seen this, I experience it and I see this over and over. That's when a sport really clicks for a young person, is when you find peers to do that with, that you enjoy and feel supported by.
Brian Stansel.
Brian Stansel. So when did you know, was it in high school? When did you know that because by this point, correct me if I'm wrong, you had really started focusing on whitewater paddling and maybe even done a little bit of actual whitewater slalom. And when did you realize you had some chops at this, Sue Norman, like that maybe you were good at it and there was something to it?
Yeah. Well, the thing that was really fortunate about the Keel Haulers Canoe Club and being in that part of the world at that time is there was a very large and active club network throughout the East. And sadly, that doesn't really exist today.
No.
But back then, every club put on at least one citizen slalom race a year, and it was fun. It wasn't for serious stuff. It was a recreational thing that people did, like a fun run. They do a fun slalom, and there was kids from other states that would come to that. And so again, there was that appeal of doing this thing that had, um, the sport that had other kids my age that I wanted to be a part of. And there happened to be a few other girls. There was only a few other women that were ahead of us that were paddling. And so all of us young girls that were coming in, and there was probably about 6 or 8 of us, got a lot of attention from those 3 women that came ahead of us, as well as from other, adults. And I don't ever remember too often being discouraged because I just was another warm body that was there, and they wanted to encourage us. But I think it definitely started changing for me when I started figuring out how to work out. Because up until, I was always an athletic kid, but I've been very spindly. I was small, I was skinny, and I got put on a weight program from a couple of guys with another friend of mine, and we started, um, building muscle. And what I felt right away was how much that changed my ability in kayaking. Instead of being a piece of flotsam that was getting pushed down the river, I was able to take control of my boat and actually do things with it, so I could match skills with strength.
And just for everyone, when we say slalom,
Yeah.
whitewater slalom, we mean there are, like you see in the Olympics, gates hanging over the river. The first Olympic slalom was in 1972, and you're describing sort of mid 70s, late 70s. Is this when you're sort of talking right now?
Yes, uh, we moved to Ohio. This was the early '70s, right during this time when I was doing this citizen racing, was when a US paddler was the first time they had the Olympics, and a US paddler named Jamie McEwen won a bronze medal in whitewater C1, and that just energized the whole this whole recreational slalom thing that existed. All of a sudden, it was like, we want to be an Olympian like Jamie and win medals.
I remember, so growing up in Europe, where you ended up, we'll talk about how you got there, but I remember my first slalom races were local kayak club slalom races. That, the little paddling club there would put on something on the Loisach, and we would paddle and race, and and everyone was there, all comers, like beginners, advanced kids, very, very serious slalom paddlers. In fact, I would say that there was a broken paddle that came down, some like wood schlegel that floated down the river, and I waded out and grabbed this broken paddle, and I still have it at home. Like, I'm sure that's in my parents' basement.
in your
this
closet.
old,
It's in that closet.
this old schlegel that I got when I was like, 13 years old. It's still like this totemic object in my life.
Okay, so your high school, you have joined this club, and you're starting to realize you have some chops at whitewater paddling. But I really want you to tell the story about your dad sitting you and your brother down when you're 18 and sort of telling you what you should do next. And the reason that this made me smile as I was reading it is the contrast between that and like what I do and most of my friends do with their kids in terms of like next steps. We're, helping our kids, seriously in every way with tutors and athletics and, the amount of like support and scaffolding we can give. We then go on college tours. We talk about this for a year. They have counselors and tutors. It's a whole thing, right? I mean, it's just this huge parent-child scaffolding that's created to sort of like move most of our kids on to college or whatever, trade school or whatever next thing they're going to be doing. It wasn't really like that for you and your brother. And it was such a contrast when I read it. I thought you should tell the story.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's right about, it was the beginning of our senior year. He sat us down at the kitchen table and said, here's the deal. My job is going to be done when you turn 18, and I'm going to have to take a break. He couldn't stay in the job that he was in anymore. He mentally, he needed a break. So his plan was to go live out of his car for a while, and just give himself a sabbatical, and that we needed to have a plan for what we were going to do when we graduated from high school. And he gave us 3 options. One was to bum around with him in his car and do whatever he was going to do.
And you don't mean Sprinter van.
No, old Yankee Ford station wagon that smelled like cigars and dogs. And then the second option was to, get a job and put ourselves through college, but he had no money at all to provide us any assistance. And the third was to join the military. And so I chose the military, and he encouraged that. He said, "I think this is your best option." And, it was scary, but I am so grateful that my dad had that talk with me and had the foresight and understood, our situation and my situation, because it's really was a key, it changed the trajectory of my life in a way that was only positive, and I really don't know what other path I could have taken.
Tell us more about that.
Well, it was like I said, it was scary, and it wasn't something, it wasn't preferred path, and I actually got an offer because I did do a lot of training that last year, and I really started really coming into my own in slalom paddling that whole summer before I went to the Army. And one of the women that was coaching me invited me to said, if you want to come live with me and my parents and go to community college in New Jersey, and train, you could do that. And I was tempted for a second, but I could see that I wouldn't be able to set myself up for the rest of my life with that plan. Paddling was not competitive paddling. You weren't going to make a living as a competitive athlete. You had to
Someone once described as standing in a cold shower, ripping up $20 bills.
Yeah. So anyway, I went into the Army, and it kind of fit right away, actually, because what I found out, even though I was a good paddler, I was still a very average athlete, on my high school basketball, which is, now that I think about, that was a total joke. But again, they took what any warm body back then, and track. But when I went into the Army, I was like the super athlete of our company, not just my platoon, because the majority of women that got recruited in the Women's Army Corps had zero athletic background. So I didn't, it was just this, and I when I talk to kids today, like I never talk to any kid that thinks they want to go into the military that I run into. Maybe that's because I live in a fun mountain town, but um, for me, it was a combination of feeling very safe. I was going to have someone tell me what to do. I didn't have to make decisions for myself. They provided me a bunk. They provided me food. They gave me a job. And I was going to be safe for 3 years. And I could handle it. I could handle the challenges physically and mentally. I felt successful. It was
Yeah, I mean,
experience.
it seems like it was actually just what you needed after so many years of not feeling safe and, generally not secure. So before we go on in time anyway, because this will become so relevant as we get into talking about, I mean, this is all stuff in your memoir, of course, but as we get into talking about you becoming a mother in your 50s, up until this point, you going to the military, you are, basically doing this unusual and difficult childhood in partnership with your twin brother. And you guys were kind of a unit. And I'm sure, like many twins, had a very close relationship. And in fact, when you enlisted in the military, he did as well, and that's my understanding. But it was when you left for the Army and he decided to go a different way that your relationship, I think that was the first time it really changed. And this will become very relevant for later parts of this conversation. But, what was it like growing up with a twin? And then, tell us a little bit about how you sort of went your separate ways at 18
Yeah.
in a big way.
Yeah, we were extremely close growing up, especially because we moved around so much. So we were each other's only friend for much of our childhood. But he was always very different from me, and uh, just had different interests. He wasn't into sports. He liked board games. We just had really different strengths and interests. And when we both were given this talk by our dad about, make a plan, and like I said, like you said, he joined the military too. But while I was spending that summer going to kayak racing camps, he got recruited by a religious cult, and a pretty extreme one. And so he backed out of his enlistment and did that for a couple of years. And that was um, kind of whereas what I did set me up, I think, for an upward trajectory for the rest of my life. What he did the exact opposite.
This episode of the Ready State podcast is brought to you by Momentous.
We believe in the stack. Probably need to add some protein to your diet because you're a busy working person.
True fact. And you're getting older.
You got to take an omega.
Yep.
We love that. And creatine.
Yep.
Right?
That's
Super
the key
non-negotiable.
stack. Yeah.
I mean, I put everyone on vitamin D because I think you need some. But that creatine is a big deal. And what we're starting to see is that people are taking creatine.
Yeah. You cannot be on the internet and even have the slightest interest in health and not see creatine.
It's having a moment.
I started taking creatine in high school. Creatine is hot right now. It's hot.
That's right. And what we want everyone to remember is a couple things. Well, number one is that it needs to be creatine monohydrate.
Yeah, we learned from creatine expert Dr. Darren Kandow on our podcast that there's literally no need to take creatine with anything else in it. And if companies are selling you creatine plus whatever, it's just a marketing gimmick. Like just creatine monohydrate is what you need to take.
Now, I'm going to say something controversial. The creatine you're currently taking from Amazon is trash. Why? It's not NSF certified, which means that it is tested for purity. It is tested for what it actually has, that the contents of the creatine bottle are actually full of creatine, and only creatine.
Well, and like all other Momentous products, it's made with the highest quality ingredients, and what it says on the outside is actually in the bag.
And if anyone ever pushes back and Momentous uses Creapure, which is the studied one, right? Their
Yeah.
creatine
It's the
is
highest quality
right.
creatine there is.
And people are like, man, it's still creatine monohydrate. Man. I'm like, is that NSF certified? Talk to the hand. Because if it's not, literally, you cannot trust the Wild West of Amazon anymore. That ship has sailed. 80% of supplements don't contain their active ingredients.
Honestly, I think you just if you can't afford or deal with a really high quality supplement, there's probably a few exceptions. You just need to work on getting what you need from food.
More steak.
More steak.
Get on the stack, get on the protein, get on the good quality omega, get on the creatine, and let those chips ride for like a decade or so. And you're going to see, you and I just had DEXAs. You got to do this. This is all about bone health, muscle health, brain health, and maybe a little bit of power.
Maybe a little bit of power.
Everyone needs it. NSF. If you want to learn more, go to livemomentous.com/TRS and use code TRS and save up to 35% at checkout.
This episode of the Ready State podcast is brought to you by Element.
You know what is happening in the world?
Let's hear it.
We're seeing a revolution in whole food nutrition, especially among athletes. People who are breathing hard, working hard, they're getting their grams, they're getting their protein in. And guess what is missing from the diet? And I can't believe I have to say this: salt.
Well, and a lot of these people are really focused on trying to pull out as many of the ultra processed foods they can in their diet, which is great. We're fans of that. And often the reason that ultra processed foods are so palatable is they're loaded with salt. And so to the extent anyone's over consuming salt, which is hard, and you're going to explain that, it's because they're eating a ton of ultra processed foods. But when people clean up their diet, they're not getting enough salt in many cases.
Look, your brain is hardwired to need salt. Like if you want to see how bad you feel, don't eat any salt for a few days. You're going to be like, I feel so uncrispy,
crampy.
Right? The idea of like feeling crispy is like, you drink that crisp soda water kind of thing. A sparkling element is very crispy.
Yeah.
But what we're finding is that you can chase salt up to when something starts to be too salty. But before that, your body
brain
handles
knows.
that. You're a master of handling salt. It is so important to your system.
And one of the best ways that we know to add a little bit of extra salt into our diet.
It's so fun.
And it's not just about adding salt, it's about adding joy.
And
hydration is in the form of lemonade salt, which is a limited edition flavor. Hopefully not limited edition, but you've got to check it out.
Georgia came home from college today, and she was like, lemonade, Element.
Yeah.
And you know what we said? We were like, put it down, you little tramp.
Yeah, you get one a day. You get one element a day. That's how we have to deal with it in our household.
Literally, I'm like, I love you.
This stuff is so
but
good.
You cannot have my lemonade
It's
Element.
so good.
Right now, if you order through our link, you can get a free sample pack featuring 8 Element flavors. And of course, if you want to party in your mouth, try the sparkling. Go to drinklmnt.com/TRS.
We literally drink it every day.
Every day.
So this will now bring us to this crazy thing that you have in common with Kelly, which is spending time kayaking in the Bavarian hamlet of Garmisch-Partenkirchen in southern Germany.
I moved there in 81.
And this is bonkers because you actually, your job in the military, you were military police by training, but at least for part of the years you were in the military, your job was actually teaching kayaking, which always makes me laugh.
I could be really good in the military.
Yeah, it always makes me laugh. And I think, how did you score a job in the military teaching whitewater kayaking to other members of the military?
Yeah. I had a ferry paddling godmother. It's the only way I can explain it, because the way I even found out about it is I was working in an office for a short while, updating regulations, and stumbled across a regulation that referred to the Armed Forces Recreation Center. And after World War II, the U.S. military took over a few choice places in Germany and created these recreation centers to provide activities for the troops to do in their off time. And they taught golf and tennis and skiing and rock climbing and whitewater kayaking. And I couldn't believe it, really, because it was 1977, I think, at this point, and kayaking was still just super young sport in the U.S., but Germany is where kayaking was invented. So it was not a new sport there. So I found out about this program, and I sent in an application, and I didn't expect to get anywhere with that because my commander had to approve the application. And when I submitted to him to do that, he said, "I'm not going to do that. We're always too short of military police personnel. I can't do that." And I almost didn't send it in, but I decided to do it anyway because I thought it would set me up for the next year, to at least for them to know that I was out there. And what ended up happening is that application got floated up to the commander of the European forces in Germany, and he wrote a letter to my commander saying, "This girl is going to be transferred down to Garmisch-Partenkirchen to teach kayaking because the guy who's doing it now is getting shipped out, and we have to shut down the program if we can't send this girl because we did a worldwide search in the US military, and there's no one else in the military that knows how to kayak." So So I was, yeah, it was one of the most unbelievable, I didn't feel like I did much to make that happen. So again, I can only attribute it to the fairy paddling godmother.
I'm just being inundated with like throwback memories and experiences.
Yeah, I mean, just so everybody knows, Kelly moved. I mean, this was like 1977. You started there, so you were there between like basically the late 70s, and then
Yeah.
you show up in the same town coincidentally in what, like 1985?
81.
81.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I'm not kayaking for another chunk
Yeah, a
of time.
few years.
So
Well, you were like 6.
But what's interesting is that my mother had moved to Germany. She was a single working parent. She just finished her PhD. We have some friends in that big expatriate community there, and we're just going to be there. The dollar becomes really good under Reagan, and we end up. My mom realizes, hey, we can have a high quality of life here, and all of our friends are AFRC, these Armed Forces Recreation Center guides, and
Yeah.
she's dating mountain guides, and kayaking and being a guide was the highest calling for me because all the cool kids.
Right,
in our living room, we're all kayak instructors, river guides, ski guides, mountain guides.
yeah,
I worshipped
amazing.
at the feet of Sue Norman, and I bet there were photos of you paddling up on the on. I mean, it really is amazing. I think about just how early that was in the kind of kayaking evolution. Just plastic boats are just starting to happen, and really, what an amazing time.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just going to set it up because we've got to keep moving here. You leave the military, you actually do use the GI Bill to go to college. Exactly, like you're the prime example of why that is awesome. But you also then return to your serious paddling career and ultimately become U.S. national champion. What year was that? And do I have that right in terms of timeline?
Yeah, that was 1982.
Yeah,
that
Sue
I
Norman.
was national champion.
And I just want to point out right now, we're talking to a person who is literally like the first woman on Mars. That's what your kayaking and racing experience is, being a national champion. Right now, if you fast forward and went and just searched Jessica Fox and you went and watched this Australian woman paddle, she is the greatest slalom athlete in the history of the world and so sophisticated and doing VO2 max training and lactate training. And it's incredible where the sport has evolved and within our lifetime. It's really, I just want to point out, your lineage is so important to us and this experience, but you were basically the speed of innovation and technique. And it's really remarkable. Even the fact that you were strength training in paddling, that is a revolution.
Yeah.
So I really have to skip ahead. Otherwise, this is going to be a 3-hour podcast, Sue Norman. But I'll just go ahead and say that, again, talking about that different trajectory between you and your brother. I mean, you go to college on the GI Bill. You end up going to graduate school at UC Davis, and then landing a pretty choice job working for the U.S. Forest Service, which you did until you retired. And created an amazing life in South Lake Tahoe, California. And then at some point, and within that, you continue to stay very connected to the whitewater world. But at some point, as we talked about at the beginning of this, you all decide you want to, try your turn again at this whitewater racing, which is where I come into the picture. And we're talking about, I think, like, mid 90s. And, you are, I believe, 12 or 13 years older than me. So I joined the team when I was like 23 years old, and I think you were almost 40.
Yeah.
So at that point, you've established yourself, you own a home, you have a regular job at the U.S. Forest Service. Like, what were you thinking in your right mind to put together a team and go race on the biggest whitewater on earth on the Zambezi, Zambezi River?
I want everyone to know these races aren't like, you would not do these rivers for fun.
No, like, we'd be too scared.
Like, just if you're listening to everyone, think of the biggest whitewater you've ever seen.
Now think a little bigger.
Now think a little bigger.
Yeah. So, it sort of tracks a little bit for me because I was just coming off my Division I college rowing career. I was a guide. I was sort of working presently as a Class 4 river guide. So it was sort of a natural extension of what I was doing. Wasn't.
You got out.
Really
you were safe.
Yeah, it wasn't really a natural extension of what you were doing. Other than that, you obviously have this lifelong history of whitewater paddling. But like, what were you thinking, Sue Norman?
Well, I got pulled into it. It wasn't. I mean, it was a choice, but I was. It was Kelly and Julie, my longtime friends, because my rafting experience to this day is, I would say, minimal. As far as me going out and leading a group of people on a trip like those guys did, but I had the competition background and the competition experience that had to be adapted to rafting, because raft racing, they did downriver races, they did sprint races, they did slalom races. And Julie and Kelly were very aware of my kayaking ability, and they wanted me to bring that experience into the raft. And I'd seen the videos of the Zambezi River,
or the Pequari,
Yeah.
or the Orange.
River Ventazon.
Well, the
Oh my gosh.
Zambezi was the first big race the big white Class 5 race we did. And I'd seen video footage of Kelly, because she was part of the first team of commercial guides to go there and scout that out for commercial boating. And I had a lot of I was like, I don't know if I can do that, you guys. I mean, you can't Eskimo roll a raft. I don't think I could, And Kelly told me something that I never forgot and kind of changed it. She said, well, you don't have to, you just have to hang on to the raft, and I'll make sure you have something to hang on to. So I decided to go and give it a shot.
I just want to just interrupt for a second, because I've paddled the Zambezi, and it is so big and so chaotic. And I just will you tell everyone just real quick, just peek in, what kind of swimmer you are?
Terrible. To this day, terrible. Because I learned how to, when I was a smaller kid kayaking, I always got scooped up by the club when I swam. So I didn't have to swim. I'd come out of my kayak and I'd grab someone's, grab at the back of their boat, and they'd pull me in.
And you're wearing a PFD.
And I'm wearing PFD. And then I learned how to Eskimo roll, And so it's like, okay, if I flip, I'm going to roll, So I really had not experienced swimming a lot in my paddling career. And every time I did, I always thought I was drowning. Even if it was Class 3, I thought I was drowning because I was so uncomfortable in it. But yeah,
We just need to put a pin in that, because,
because
Sue Norman is a 5-time national champion, 3-time world champion,
and a
whitewater
slalom
paddler.
paddling, multiple champion in 2 different events, 2 different sports, and self-described not a strong swimmer. And I have seen you swim. It's true, you're not a strong swimmer, and it's really the reason I don't want to bring it up just to try to poke fun, but it's so extraordinary that you went ahead and had this experience and could put yourself into these positions, and just the faith that it's gonna work out, and that you're gonna. I don't think it was ever even. I don't think I learned that about your swimming capacity until like decades after I'd seen you race and shred, and it's really. And even I think I plucked you out of the food of the foo once.
Probably.
You definitely did. It's so funny too, because the amount of gigantic, unbelievably gigantic Class 5 rapids you and I have swam together is a lot of them.
Yeah.
And a story that I'll tell, we go down to the Zambezi, and we are there weeks in advance. So we're just running it day after day after day. And we kept swimming at least once on all of our runs. And
It's bad, by the way.
It's bad. It's bad. And we just couldn't have a day where we didn't flip and swim at least once.
And I don't mean no one on this boat casually flips it, like falls in. That's not what's happening.
No. And
it's
we're
catastrophic.
By the way, yeah.
End over end.
And just like
chundering.
Reminder, we're going down with literally the greatest whitewater humans out there.
And there are crocs in there too. Just want everyone to know.
Yeah, there's crocodiles in there and whatever. So there is a god of the river, Zambezi, called Inyaminyami. And everybody in Victoria Falls who's doing anything on the river is wearing an Inyaminyami necklace. And so we have day after day.
I made
us
stop and get in Yam before we paddled down.
So we are getting just housed every single day by this river. And we're like, we're definitely not going to thrive. We are going to do terribly in this race. And we go to the little local outdoor market and we all buy an Inyaminyami and
just
put
a little
it on.
snake necklace. No big deal.
And then we never flipped again after that. Do you remember that, Sue Norman?
Yeah. Yeah.
There's not even a question in that. I just am telling that story.
Yeah.
I want to also set this up because this is part of the Juliet lore. Whenever we're in a group of people and you have to tell a funny story about yourself, they're like, tell us something funny about you. And I'm like, I like ice cream. And then Juliet says, I was attacked by a hippo. You were on that trip when Juliet was attacked by a hippo. Can you just give us a 1-minute Reader's Digest outside the canoe? I've heard Juliet kind of talk about what it's like to take a stroke and look down inside a hippo's mouth and be launched into the air and then swim through the water. What's it like to see your friend attacked by a hippo? This is true story, everyone.
Yeah, it's terrible. And I have to say, it's one of my hardest chapters I had to eject from the book because I loved that so much. My editor said, you have way too much whitewater stuff. We got to talk about the parenting stuff. But it was, Juliet and one of our other teammates gets attacked by a hippo.
Sorry, Brooke.
In a hippo alley. The boat literally comes up out of the water and flops over, but they fall out this other side from where I can see. So I just see this canoe come up out of the water and flip over, and there's no heads. But we all know what happened. There's a hippo under there, and we did not see heads for quite a while. So I'm paddling like a maniac towards their canoe to rescue them from this hippo. And in the meantime, my teammate Julie is paddling away from them as far as she can because she remembered the hippo safety talk. Never go towards the attacked canoe because the hippo's going to attack you next. But fortunately, so we just actually held steady, not moving anywhere in the river, while you guys finally came flying out from the end of the canoe towards shore. And I've never seen anyone swim like that before or since. It was like,
that was my best swimming I've ever done.
Oh my God. Your whole upper bodies were out of the water and your arms were just churning and you were just motoring to shore like rockets.
But fortunately, there were only Cape Buffalo on the bank, right?
Yeah, it was fine. It was
totally fine.
There were just other things.
I think that's a really nice segue. Your instinct is to paddle for danger, to paddle to rescue your friend, to paddle towards doing the right thing, even at the sort of the cost to yourself. We've known you a long time, and we were very surprised when you decided that you were going to become a mother at age 50. Can you tell us a little bit about, because this is such an extraordinary sort of full circle moment of you paddling towards uncertainty.
And just to set this up a little bit, because we had to kind of gloss over like 20 years of your life just in the interest of keeping things moving. You had specifically chosen not to be a mother. I'm sure it had many opportunities where you could have made that a thing, and you decided that wasn't going to be your life. And instead you were, busy working this great job at the U.S. Forest Service and traveling around the world and adventuring. And you had a really strong set of friends who also did not have children. And that's sort of what you thought your life would look like going forward. So, what happened here?
Yeah. Well, as you said, I did not choose to be a mother. It's never a path I would have chosen. I would have lived a totally content life if that had never happened. It was nothing I ever considered for myself. And frankly, my brother didn't choose to have a child. They just were careless. But when I was 52 years old, I got a call while I was in Hawaii at an outrigger canoe training camp. And he called up with this 20-something-year-old woman to tell me that they were gonna be parents. And, yeah, it was I knew right away this was a terrible thing that was happening, and, but I faked it. It's like, "Oh, great," and, long story short.
And in their defense, you're going to be the greatest auntie of all time. You're like the
Well,
sportiest, raddest, hardcore auntie a person
yeah,
could
but
ever
they
want for.
lived in Cleveland, I lived in California, it was, and I didn't actually really believe it was my brother's child. I actually had to pay for the paternity test, but then it's like it came back positive. So I started going to Cleveland, when Seth was about a year and a half. I started doing regular visits to kind of see what I could do to help out. And it just got worse and worse and worse every visit I went. And then things really went into the crapper when the birth mom who was taking care of Seth decided she was going to leave her relationship and um, couch surf for a while and ended up getting arrested. And it just got to the point where I realized I'd been fretting about this young boy who I have to say, even though I never wanted to be a mom, when I first met Seth and I held him in my lap, I had this religious experience where it was this recognition and this love that mothers describe, when they're handed their baby. And I couldn't understand it. And really, but it happened. And my stepmother said, I think it's because he looks so much like your brother. It was like you were meeting him again, across the crib. And it's like, well, maybe that was it, but whatever. I was emotionally invested, and by the time Seth was 4, I things had disintegrated to the point where I realized this has to change, or his life is really gonna, he's gonna end up in foster care. There was no doubt, and I moved him, my brother, and him out to California.
And how old was Seth?
Pardon?
How old was Seth then?
He was 4, and I was 56
Yeah.
when he
So,
moved out.
so just to set this up, in all those years, you were busy on your upward trajectory. Your brother continued to struggle in life, I think, without going into great detail. But they both move out to California.
Yes.
And at this point, I think you think that you're just creating proximity and hopefully, right, going to create a bit of scaffolding of support for your brother, but that he's going to be the primary parent. I mean, am I right on that? You're thinking that
Oh,
like
yeah.
this is what's going to happen.
Yeah. Well,
And that by, yeah,
it was never realistic, but only way I did this was by totally embracing denial and avoidance. So I just like, I'm gonna move you out, and I'll help set you up in a house. You'll parent Seth, and I'll be the active auntie. There was nothing ever realistic about that. I just created this story in my head that I could accept enough
right.
to do that. But there was no way that was ever gonna work. But
And
it took me another year to
realize that.
realize that.
And what happened during that year? Or was there a final straw? What made you finally realize like this is not a go, and I'm going to need to become a full-time parent?
Yeah, well, I actually, because I moved Seth out first, and then David was supposed to wrap up things at his home in Cleveland and come out, and he didn't come out for several months. And my brother, his problem is alcoholism. 30 years hardcore, going on 40 now, and tied to depression. Um, and I didn't understand any of that. Our lives just hadn't been connected enough for me to understand that he had that level of a drinking problem and mental health issues. And when he came here, we started going to therapists. I got a crash course in all of that. And through working with 2 different therapists, one that I was seeing with my brother and another one that I was seeing with Seth, I got a really quick understanding that the only chance Seth had was for me to become his parent, and provide the safety and security he needed. And he needed to have a relationship with his dad, of course, because they loved each other very much. But I had to be the one to set the boundaries. And so then
So
I
The
applied
Sue
for
Norman
Juliet.
Army. I'm starting to see some strong parallels, right?
tell us a little bit about what it is like to become an unexpected parent at 56 years old, especially as someone who consciously chose not to have children. What was the impact? What was it like? How did it change your life?
And I want to just double click on something. This book is about risk, right? This sort of did this feel like risk, or does it just, oftentimes my friends who do risky things don't perceive it as risky. In retrospect, you're like, whoa, that was a big risk, or we took a big chance, or there were a lot of unknowns, but it just seems like you step into the next thing. We have to go down the river. We have to do the race. We have to, it seems to me that there was a lot of internal awareness and dialogue and setup, but you just committed to this thing. Does it feel
Yeah, but
risky?
I felt like I was jumping off a cliff without a parachute. So it felt like the riskiest thing I'd ever done, and, unlike paddling, I took risks with a very strong skill set. And this risk I
You
took
weren't a
with
strong swimmer
no
then
skill
either,
set.
girl.
I know, well, the swim yeah, but swimming isn't the most important thing to know how to do it as a paddler. But I had nothing, so when I jumped into this, I felt like I had no skills, and I felt like I was jumping off a cliff. And I struggled. It was really hard, and I was also going through menopause. So I was dealing with all those hormonal changes that affects your moods and your sleep. And I couldn't separate out the causes of all the things that made me feel like I was losing my mind and I couldn't think straight. But that's where I was for probably 2 years. I was just barely surviving and functioning as a
And
holding things together.
one of the things you talked about that was so impactful, and I don't think you feel mad at anybody, but it really changed your friendships, because up till that point, your primary friend group was other childless people who like to do adventures.
Yeah.
And those folks didn't necessarily want to spend their weekend with a 5-year-old. But tell us a little bit about that and sort of how your friendship life changed.
Yeah, it completely changed. I completely lost a whole community that I was very tied to, and like you said, I'm not angry because I understand it. I would have been that person, you
Right.
know?
Right.
As well. And what was frustrating, though, was that I couldn't recreate a new group because of my age is is what it felt like, and also because of Seth's, some of the challenges he had. It was difficult for us to join a mommy group with kids his age, because of some of the challenges he had, and then the fact that I was 20, 25 years older than.
Yeah, you needed a paddling club, not a mommy group.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And talk a little bit about sort of how Seth was doing. Because I know that it was difficult, and
I think I saw Seth around the holiday break,
Yeah.
and he's like 6'2" and
Yeah, it's amazing.
handsome,
It's
and just
amazing. Yeah.
it's this giant
It's
person.
been
I'm like,
ama-
wow, Sue Norman has like the most
Yeah.
handsome, studly son ever.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it hasn't always been like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, he was, I guess this is where maybe this sort of ties into some of the themes in your book, Risk, which we've alluded to a lot, but haven't talked to. But obviously, this has been an insane journey for you, becoming a mom at 56 and having it literally upend your life in every way. What did you learn about, raising a child, especially a child that spent the first part of their life in a neglected situation, I
Yeah.
think is the word I would use.
Or one that even echoed some of your experience of uncertainty.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Well, you know, what I learned is one is I had to take care of myself, that I couldn't be a good parent if I wasn't doing what I needed to feel like I could get up in the morning and make decisions and be happy in my life. No child is going to grow up well if their parent is unhappy. And so
Right.
very quickly, I was, you know, tried to find, and I'm very fortunate. I live in Lake Tahoe. Can't stress that enough, that I live in this beautiful environment where I could take my kid out, at 4, 5, 6 years old and drag him in a sled, carry him on my back, put him in a boat, and we go out and do stuff in the woods. It would calm me, it would calm him. You know, the outdoors is this beautiful natural playground for kids. I mean, one of my favorite chapters in the book is about our trip on the Rogue River when I went with my raft team with Juliet and Beth and Julie and your kids. And that was the first moment I felt peace after I'd brought Seth to California. That was the first time I realized really what I needed to do in order to survive this, was to make sure that we stayed in this river community, in an outdoor community, and we had that strong connection. And, it's still the foundation for me, for my grounding. I'm not going to say that it's necessarily Seth's. He enjoys it, but his grounding is actually creative arts. His grounding is theater and music, which is great actually, because he can pursue that without any competition with me.
Well,
know.
and let's just be like teenagers. I mean, I can't get my kids to kayak. I mean, let's be honest.
Yeah.
Like they'll do every other thing but whitewater kayak because dad likes the whitewater kayak. Yeah, I'm talking to you,
Yeah.
Georgia.
Yeah, but what we do that he enjoys is river trips, so we do multi-day river trips. We have property down in the foothills where we can take his friends rafting. We do stuff that works for him. I've never tried to drag him
No.
onto my path in paddling, but I do think it is part of his package, of hopefully when he is an adult that he'll have to, have that connection along with his music stuff
So,
too.
have you thought about or sort of acknowledged? I mean, it's so obvious that when you were put into this very difficult situation, you sort of reverted to what you knew, which is, and even your own childhood, which is like the shining light of your own childhood was spending time in the outdoors, and that you sort of had this setup and capability and ability to take Seth out into the wilderness with you. I mean, I have to think that you feel like that was like your savior in some ways in
Oh, it
raising a
totally was.
challenging child.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And he was just easier to manage. I mean, it's always been, I mean, to this day, frankly, and he's turning into a wonderful young man in many ways, but it is always so much easier for us. Um, in our interaction, we're closer. Um, It's just a lot of beautiful things happen when we're out doing adventures in the outdoors, and I don't have to fight with the electronics when we're at home, the distractions, the the things that kids get, sucked into that really pull them away from their parents in life, really.
So I think we would be remiss if we didn't talk about your awesome partner, Lisa.
Yes.
Because we have touched a little bit about on how challenging it was for you to have to basically recreate your entire community from scratch in sort of a difficult circumstance because of your age and sort of being thrown into being a parent. But your partner Lisa was also effectively thrown into being a parent, and she definitely did not sign up for that, and also didn't have that kinship connection.
Yeah.
So talk to us a little bit about that and
Yeah.
what that was like.
Yeah, and first of all,
and like
Lisa,
shout out,
we see you. Shout out Lisa.
We're just giving her
Yeah.
some snaps right here. Shout out to Lisa,
Yeah.
because I know she's been basically with you every step of the way in this parenting
Power
journey.
auntie.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, I couldn't have done it without her, and, to 2 things. One, you know well, I couldn't have done it without her, and when I had to do it on my own the first 2 years because I was still working. And we have 2 separate houses, even though we're married. And we've always had this relationship where we, come to each other's houses but we live our lives. And because we got together
On
when we
different
were
sides of the
older,
lake, I'll say, right?
different sides of the lake.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's an easy commute. Yeah. And they're both pretty nice places to be. But when I retired, I did give her an ultimatum. I said, I can't do this on my own. I can't continue our relationship unless I can move in with you, because I don't have the bandwidth for this distance relationship and I need help. And the way we decided to approach that is we decided we'd try it for a year. And we both went into that knowing, like, so that I think that was really important. It was, we both needed the escape route and to talk very honestly about it. And I told her, I said, if you decide not to do this, I'm not going to be angry. I'm just telling you, where I'm at. And I totally get it if you don't want to do this. But she stood up and said, okay, you can move in. It was, so I lived over in her house in Truckee for 5 years. I don't think she would say that was easy. It was hard. That was a lot of the time when we really had to deal with a lot of the behavior issues that Seth dealt with. Again, though, what I was very clear about what I needed from her, and she didn't have to be a 50-50 parent. She had to be able to step in maybe 20% of the time. But that 20% of the time was absolutely critical. That's what enabled me to do the other 80%.
And I want to say, and I'm just generalizing here, but it would have been a lot easier if you'd had a daughter.
Yeah.
Young feral boys are feral and
Yeah.
not necessarily on the same wavelength as you two, like wilderness photographer, superstar. And now, though, it is amazing to have this, quasi-adult man. I feel like you either, one of our friends, Marco, said, as a human, you either eat all your all at once or a little bit at a time. And I really feel like you guys ate a lot of it right up front.
Yeah.
And having this boy, and I guess what I'm trying to say is, I don't know if I was like Juliet's like, hey, we're going to adopt a son. I'd be like, ooh, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a lot. A little boy is a lot.
Yeah. Well, and a big boy is a lot too. I mean, because we don't get into conflict nearly as much. I mean, it was daily, multi-daily when he was younger, and now it's a lot less frequent. But when we get mad at each other, now I've got a 6'2" deep-voiced man being mad at me,
Yeah.
So we've really had to deal with that. I've had to have talks with him. It's like, when you get angry at me now, I don't feel safe. We got to figure out how to do this differently. Even though he's having, a teenage tantrum, and I'm really not unsafe, but the energy is definitely,
And how tall are you, Sue?
I'm 5'4", and I just found out I shrunk. I'm 5'3 3/4".
You're still 5'4". You always be 5'4".
I shrunk too, Sue. It's okay.
I just want to say, there's so many parallels in your story. I don't know if you and I have even really talked about it. I had an estranged father, battled alcoholism, one of 5, children of alcoholics.
Mhm.
And, there are 5 generations of alcoholics. And I did not even want to have boys because I was like, there's no way I think I told Juliet, I was like, don't worry, we're having girls.
Yeah. Break the cycle.
We're breaking the cycle. So, the relationship of having this difficult relationship with my father, who was absent most of the time, and then managing his, being a son of an alcoholic parent, and then finding the river. It really just anchored me outdoors and gave me, a compass that through college, beyond college, the things I started, my first jobs, my partner, a river runs through it is really the truest piece of all time. It really resonates with me, this book.
And we both have a life saved by the river.
Amen.
Life saved by the river. So, 2 questions here, Sue. First of all, I think we've touched on it a little bit, but why did you name this book Risk? And then you describe this, I sort of mentioned it as a memoir, but you actually describe it as a parenting book. And there are so many lessons to be learned for all parents in this book. But what are one of two, if
Talk
your
about
dreams
why
come
is it
true,
called risk, and talk about
what are parents going to be able to take away from this? Either there's lots to be inspired by in your story, but what are sort of the core lessons you hope parents take away here?
Well, I was playing around with this phrase of good risk and bad risk, right? When I started writing this, and it became really clear to me that, when I was writing about the parenting, I was writing about dealing with at risk a childhood trauma, bad risk. And then when I was writing about Whitewater, I was talking about chosen risk, and that when you're doing a outdoor adventure sport, you're consciously doing something that is involving risk. You know it, it's part of the package, and you're actually drawn to the chemicals that are released from that, the endorphins and the adrenaline. And you get a positive benefit from that. You learn how to face challenges, you learn how to build resiliency through this managed risk. When you're parenting a child who had early years at risk, and you yourself grew up in that situation, you have all kinds of I had all kinds of baggage to deal with, I still do, that I didn't realize I even had until I was trying to parent a kid. I didn't realize I had a problem with anger until I was trying to parent a kid, you know? And he definitely has issues with anger. It's just one of those things that comes out. And the difference between the bad risk is that your stress that you experience as a child going through that kind of thing is systemic, and it creates these cortisol poisoning. You're getting toxic poisoning from your stress experience that in affects your brain development and your emotional development. So what I'm trying to describe in the book is me learning about all that. I didn't know any of this stuff about myself until I started experiencing this and trying to manage it in Seth, and realizing what baggage I had and what he, um, how he was affected by his first 4 years, and how I used this lifetime of choosing risk through my sport to develop the resiliency and the tools to manage this situation. And it isn't just going out and getting in the outdoors. It's the lessons I learned with patience, learning, developing skills. If you're going to take on a challenge, no matter what it is, you've got to find the tools, you've got to find the teachers, you got to keep your body healthy. I mean, your book, Built to Move, was right at the right time because, I'm an older parent trying to keep a feisty young boy active and engaged in outdoors. I can't grow old yet, so I have to keep fit and I have to keep resilient so I can keep getting him out there and doing this stuff for both myself and for him.
So, how is Seth doing now? How are you doing now? What's the current state of the state?
Well, it's good, but we're still, we're not done. This is going to be a lifelong journey for
oh,
him.
bless your heart. You thought as a parent you were just gonna be like
Yeah.
18, I'm
Yeah.
retiring.
Yeah,
No,
you're-
no, that
you're not going
that
on a
model shipped out in the
You're
60s
not going
and
on
70s.
sabbatical
Yeah,
at 18,
sorry,
Sue
Mama.
Norman.
Yeah. But I think, as far as still learning and growing how to, because as, he because now he's got teenage hormones. So I'm constantly trying to figure out if what I'm dealing with is normal teenage hormone stuff, or is this still,
Right. Trauma
deep-rooted
poking its
trauma
head out
related.
again.
And then, finally I kind of reached a point where it doesn't really matter. I just got to deal with whatever the situation is in the appropriate way and de-escalate and get to some positive place. But we're doing, he's a freshman in high school. He's loving it. We have this incredible theater program, which he has dove all the way into. And he's, for the first time, and a lot of teachers told me this, he never really had a friend group through school, all the way through elementary school and middle school. Now he has a friend group. And not only does he have a friend group, but I've been around these boys. He's got a great friend group. They're smart, they're kind, they're the kind of kids you want your kids hanging out with.
You're saying at age 14 you found a paddle club?
No, well, he found his own.
That's what I'm
Yeah,
saying.
yeah.
I
Is
love
Dungeons
it.
and Dragons, though. So
But that
that's his
must be
club.
such a relief to you as a parent, because I know being a parent myself, when your kid is, and it's obviously, I don't mean to mix apples and oranges here, but when your kid is struggling with anything socially, you carry that, especially as a mom, I think.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's really difficult. And so it must be like, a great relief to you to know that he has a friend group and that he's found his
Yes.
people.
Well, and then I just see he's so passionate about what he's interested in. And I've read this over and over again. It doesn't, as long as they're not, passionate about something unhealthy, but he's passionate about really cool things that I really enjoy supporting him in. I love going to his theater performances and listening to his music and listening to him sing. It's makes me happy.
So, two more questions to Norman. You have lived a lifetime of adventure,
Lifetime.
some really big ones.
2 lifetimes.
And many of them I was lucky enough to be with
Me too.
on you, and Kelly as well. What does risk look like to you now?
I'm risk avoidant now, largely.
I'm
So
calling horse shite.
I don't know what you're talking about,
Sue
Sue Norman. It
Norman,
wasn't
you-
that long ago we just were rafting some class 5 river in Argentina. So
What does that
I
mean
know.
that you feel like you're risk avoidant now? What does
Yeah,
that
but
mean?
tell us more, tell us
because
more.
I,
Well,
your
basically
your
what it-
tolerance is much higher than the average kid. So what
Yes.
how is that
Yeah.
changing you?
yeah, mostly what it is, because I'm a scientist. And so what I am doing all the time is assessing, okay, now you're 67 years old. I'm just going to say it right here on the screen. What level of risk should you be taking?
Hmm.
So so I still backcountry ski. We did this pretty adventurous canoe trip in Canada where we got in over our head last summer. You know, um, I just am I will always take risk, but I'm constantly assessing where I'm at and realizing, I'm pretty fit for a 67-year-old, but I'm not the same person I was when I was 50. I still felt like a badass at 50. I don't really feel like a badass anymore, but I'm going to go right up to my limit,
I like
yeah.
and
that.
I'm
Well,
going to know
and
where that
I would
limit
just
is.
I can relate
I would
to that.
just like to say that I think you and Kelly and I share that, and I think it's one of the ways in which you and I really related early on in our paddling days is, I mostly feel comfortable taking risk when I feel competent,
Mhm.
and in a measured way. I've never just been a like jump over the cliff kind of person, and Kelly actually isn't either. We
Yeah.
both have a sort of measured,
Calculated risk taker.
yeah, we're calculated risk takers, and I think you've always been like that. So you're just,
I mean,
it's a different calculus
My
now that you're
calculation
67.
might be a little bit
Yeah, I
wacky.
mean, especially when you're 18.
But I just want to say I just texted my C2 partner Shane, who of course you know.
Yeah.
There was a slalom course in Europe that was flooding, and it was class 5, but the gates were just dangling in this class 5 section of town. And Shane, this is a response back from Shane. So glad we retired.
Yeah.
Because he didn't have the urge to go paddle that. And I can relate to that. We're
Okay, so one last
inner city class 5.
parting question, Sue Norman. If you could go back to one river trip, one campsite, one moment of calm in the chaos, what would that be, and who would be there?
Well, I'm going to go right to where the scene in my book, you know, because I've actually been reading this scene. I've started doing book readings for the book, and where I go now, and there's so many places I could go, but it was on our Rogue River trip that I did with you all when Seth was 5, and the Rogue is an amazing, magical river to do a family river trip on, and we had really good weather. And the second night of the trip, we were somewhere where we didn't have bugs, and it wasn't going to rain, and I decided to not put up the tent. And I write a scene about what that was like for Seth, because his first river trip. It was his first time camping, and it was his first time, sleeping out under the stars. And he was just so, he was scared, but the fact that I could make that feel safe for him that's when I realized I could do this. We got into our sleeping bags. We talked about, I showed him the stars for a while. I read him his bedtime story, and he went to sleep. And he's super comfortable in the outdoors. He always has been because of me continually doing that with him. And that's, to me, that just describes the whole thing about why rivers are so magical, to provide those kinds of experiences where you can get away from the complexity of the modern world, which can make you feel very unstable and ungrounded and overly distracted and overly stimulated. But on the river, you can find these many magical moments of just peace and connection.
And
Well-
I just will say he wasn't wrong to feel a little uncertain because there are just big bears on the river, but it's totally
Yes,
fine.
that's fine.
You were there, and we were there, but I remember that beach very well.
Well, Sue Norman, I know I speak for Kelly and I that of course we have, and I always have the most admiration for you as a human, you as an athlete, but that admiration was multiplied by thousands when you made the decision to become a parent and take Seth on and totally upend your life. So,
And I'm grateful you paddled towards the hippo attack. Thank you very much.
Yes.
I see a pattern in
thanks
your
for
life.
trying
Sue
to save
Norman.
me, Sue Norman. Thanks for trying to save me. Thank you so much for being here. Your book is amazing, inspirational. I highly recommend it to anyone, even if you're not an outdoors person or a paddler. There's so many lessons to be learned. It's so inspirational. You get a little insight into this crazy world of whitewater that Kelly and I have been talking about on this podcast forever. And so go pick up a copy.
Thank you, Sue.
Thank you so much, you guys.
Thanks, Sue Norman.